Welcome, everybody. Let me have your attention. You can keep eating, drinking, etc. I'm John Haskell, the director of the Kluge Center. I see a lot of people that I recognize from other events that we've done or the library's done, so welcome to you, and also welcome, of course, to folks who have not done Kluge Center events, and we'll make sure that you're inundated with information about subsequent events. The Dinner and Democracy series that a lot of you are familiar with, well, this dinner event is a little bit different, but it fits into our mission where we mean to be the place at the library where conversations on the challenges facing democracies happen. As you may know, we do this in different ways. We do dinner events for staff like this. We do breakfast, off-the-record conversations with scholars for members, and we do a lot of public events that staff many times come to, featuring a range of thought leaders. Just in the last year or so, we've had Anne Applebaum in a conversation down in Coolidge Auditorium, J.D. Vance, Jonathan Haidt on coddling of the American mind, and many others. I hope you'll consider attending those when you learn about them. And we're going to have information on the next Dinner and Democracy series. Those are those geeky seminars that many of you have gone to that are held over in the Madison building. We will have a new series of those coming up next year. Just last year, the Carnegie Corporation gave a generous gift to the Library of Congress to support chairs at the Kluge Center in U.S.-Russia and U.S.-China relations. Tonight represents our kickoff event for the Library of Congress chairs in U.S.-Russia and then also U.S.-China relations. Our first scholar, James Goldgeier, who's sitting right here in front of me, just came to the center last month. He will be here through May of next year. Jim's a professor. There's an extensive bio in your materials. Jim's a professor of international relations and served as dean of the School of International Service at American University from 2011 to 2017. He is, concurrent with this library appointment, a visiting senior fellow at the Council on Foreign Relations. He's held numerous public policy appointments, including director for Russian, Ukrainian, and Eurasian affairs at the National Security Council. Goldgeier is published author of 4 books, including America Between the Wars from 11/9 to 9/11, and Not Whether But When, the U.S. Decision to Enlarge NATO. Jim will be available to you in a range of ways over the next 8 months on panels like this, as well as informally through briefings with committee staff and others. We're planning events to give Congress more context on other forms of disinformation, the effectiveness of sanctions as a foreign policy tool, why what happened in Russia happened since the fall of the Soviet Union, and other topics. Let me also bring to your attention our U.S.-China chair, Minxing Pei from Claremont McKenna College, who will be in residence beginning in January for 8 months. He's one of the world's foremost experts on China. He'll be in residence here for, as I said, for 8 months. He'll be heading panels on the trade war with China, social control in China, Chinese advances in technology, and other matters. A couple of housekeeping things. We are taping this event. We may be featuring it on our website. When we move to Q&A, after about 45 minutes or an hour of presentation by the panel members, we will cut off the taping, and so that you guys are not going to appear on a library website asking a question, so don't worry about that. But anyway, carry on, and I'm going to turn the event over to Jim Goldgeier. Welcome, Jim.
All right. Come on up. Stair there if you want to stare. Either here or there's a stair here if you want. Perfect. Well, thank you all so much for coming out tonight. It's great to have such a range of folks here from different parts of the congressional staff, and it seems like this was a good topic to choose to discuss, and we look forward especially to your questions and ways in which we can help you with your work is what's most important to us. So thanks to John Haskell for his directorship of the Kluge Center, and thanks to our folks here from the Carnegie Corporation of New York. It's great to see them supporting the Kluge Center in this way. And we've got 3 amazing experts here tonight who can talk with us about different aspects of this issue of Russian information manipulation, their role in U.S. elections, and we're going to talk a little bit about to compare what we saw in 2016 with what we're seeing here in 2018. And really, given that we're only a few weeks out from this election, that we really want to make sure that we're talking about sort of a longer term about the kinds of things as a country that we should be thinking about doing in response to these activities. So I'm going to open with some discussions of my own for the three panelists, and then we do want to move into a Q&A with you all so that we make sure that we get that we answer the questions of the people who are going to be doing the actual work here. The bios are in the folder, but just mention the affiliations. Dr. Carla Robbins on the far end, who is both a professor at Baruch College and head of the Masters in International Affairs program there, as well as an adjunct senior fellow at the Council on Foreign Relations. Thomas Ridd, who is a professor at Johns Hopkins University School of Advanced International Studies and is a great addition to Washington, D.C., having come a year ago from the UK, and it's great to have him part of a very dynamic program at the Kissinger Institute at Johns Hopkins SAIS, and Dr. Alina Polyakova, who's here from the Brookings Institution, where she works not only on these issues related to Russian foreign policy, but also issues related to populism throughout Europe, which is, of course, an incredibly important topic. So we're going to start with Carla, who's going to show us a little bit about what this information manipulation actually looks like, and to just give us a sense of the kinds of things that people are seeing that are being produced by whoever she's going to tell us about who's doing the production. So, Carla, let's start with you.
Thank you so much, Jim, and thank you all. Great to see you. So the Russians push out there's a great echo here, their disinformation on a whole variety of different platforms, on local language websites. As we all know a lot about Facebook and Twitter and Instagram. They also have their RT television network and website. You guys, I don't know if you've spent any time on RT. It's somewhat mind-numbing, but I would suggest it. It definitely gives you an insight into how they think. It's Sputnik, Ruppli. They have we're going to look at a few videos from something they call In the Now, which is on YouTube and is now migrated over to Twitter. But these political technologists tailor their messages for different audiences, but certain themes are constant. Western governments are weak or unraveling. Elections are rigged. God-fearing working people are under siege by migrants, terrorists, and cosmopolitan interests. The news from corrupt corporate mainstream media can't be trusted, and truth is all relative. You have your truth, I have my truth, and yeah, maybe there were protesters beaten in Moscow, but what about Ferguson? They also have this incredible 21st century mastery of what goes viral. And as I said, they tailored this for different cultures and countries. When I worked at the New York Times, I wish I had understood to go viral as well as they're to do it, although we did it with the truth, and maybe things that aren't true do better on viral, which is a very frightening notion for someone who's a journalist. In the last year, they pushed out on websites across Central Europe a story in Polish that spreading Muslim culture had led 150,000 women in Sweden to undergo female genital mutilation. Obviously not true. A story in Czech claiming that US ships were delivering migrants to Europe. And one in Russian claiming Ukraine's health ministry is selling organs. And I just chose those from randomly. If you want to see what they're doing every day, the EU has something called the EU Disinformation Review, which you can sign up for. These things come into my inbox. And you will see just dozens of stories like this all the time coming out on different websites, not just inside of Russia, but across Central Europe, Eastern Europe, and Western Europe as well. And they are incredibly viral and quite compelling. So what I'm going to show you here are just two videos from something called In the Now, which they've developed for millennials. I've chosen them because they're in English, but also because they're pretty compelling. And I can't really tell you, what their influence is. Influence is a very interesting question, and Thomas can tell us a lot more about this because he's much more expert on it than I am. But RT, which used to be called Russia Today until they cleverly rebranded themselves, claims a reach of 700 million viewers in 100 countries. Nielsen does not track them, so we don't really know how many people watch them or click on their website. They have 3.1 million YouTube subscribers that we know, versus 4.1 million for CNN. So it's a substantial thing, but most of their clicks, if you go on their YouTube site, are for tsunamis in Japan. I mean, they're clickbait. On the other hand, a little bit goes a long way when you're talking about viral. The 2016 trawling, $100,000 in Facebook ads, 2,700 Facebook accounts, 80,000 posts, reached 126 million Americans. Slightly fewer than the number of people who voted. This question of metrics versus viral, I defer to an expert like this on this question. So when you look at the numbers on these particular videos, they look reasonably small. But one of the things, these numbers I'm going to show you are the numbers that are RT in the now numbers. One of the other things that I've noticed in looking at some of these things is they get picked up not just by pro-Russia websites, they also get picked up by alt-right websites. And there is a feedback that takes place that's quite interesting, and you can track some of it. And there's some very interesting people who are doing very interesting forensic research, like at the Atlantic Council and a variety of other places that see the way things bounce back and forth between Russian websites as well as alt-right websites. So there's a lot of very interesting work being done on this. So with that, I will show some of our favorites. Ah, yes, this is how they describe themselves. News served hot with a side of smile. It sounds so benign.
I didn't care when you got the DNC. I was silent when you hacked Clinton's emails. But this time, you've gone too far, Russia. You've touched the most sacred place, the source of all my funny vids and friends' babies' pictures. And the only reason I remember my friends' birthdays.
Russian interference in the 2016 election and how it ties to Facebook ads.
That it sold about $100,000 worth of political ads to a so-called Russian troll farm.
Yes, it was about helping Trump and hurting Hillary.
So you want me to believe that $100,000 worth of Facebook ads could swing the U.S. elections, trumping Hillary's campaign, which cost over $1 billion? And then Facebook says 25% of those ads weren't even seen by anybody. And then there's Google, who just last month said it found no such Russian ads. Okay, Google, are you sure there's no Russian interference on your platforms? That's better. If Russia wants to get better at this, then they should learn from the best, America. In 1996, Bill Clinton endorsed a $10 billion loan from the IMF to Boris Yeltsin, which helped him win the Kremlin and Russian hearts. Why? Because he was completely incompetent in letting Russia fall apart, which was exactly why he was the perfect candidate. Then Putin came along and said, get the hell out of here, America. This is our country, but that's another story. If you really want to sway an election, Russia, you got to do it the American way. Learn from the best and have the balls to spend billions. What do you guys think? Did these Facebook ads sway the U.S. elections and leave us with Trump? Comment below, give me a thumbs up or a thumbs down. It's up to you.
That's Anissa, the Tokyo Rose of our generation. And just one more. And they spent a lot of time attacking CNN, attacking the New York Times, because you couldn't possibly trust the mainstream media or anything of that sort. But they also, it's not just about the United States and Russian influence in the election. They also spent a lot of time on Syria and a variety of other things. And this one has to do with Syria.
Final messages are flying out of Aleppo, Syria. They're taking social media by storm simultaneously. It almost looks like a coordinated PR campaign.
No place now to go. It's the last place.
This may be my last video.
This might be close to, if not the last communication.
It's the last time that I talk to you.
It's almost as if they were hoping these final messages would trend and get picked up by mainstream media.
Bombs are everywhere. People are running. They don't know where, just running.
We are here living a genocide, literally.
People are executed. It's as simple as that.
It's almost like these are just innocent civilians with no message, no strategy, no politics, just people simply fighting for their lives. One day, saying goodbye to the world on social media, the next day giving interviews to BBC, CNN, and Al Jazeera, all in prime time. Well, they're not. These are activists. Some of them just recently joined Twitter and clearly support the revolution. They have thousands of followers. Some call themselves journalists and are verified on Facebook, like Bilal Abdul Karim, an American who has no problem pushing al-Nusra propaganda. You know, the rebels. This guy is a member of the White Helmets, who were founded by a British ex-military officer and have been funded with millions by the US and UK. And then there's a little girl named Bana, also joined Twitter not so long ago, in September. She's already verified and has over 200,000 followers. Bana is 7 years old and tweets in perfect English from the heart of East Aleppo with a little help from her mommy. She, of course, also had a final message just in time. So what do all of these people have in common? They want you to think there's one side to this story, one truth, that Assad is randomly going from city to city and killing his own people for some crazy reason with the help of Russia, even though the whole world is watching every step. They want you to think that these civilians pouring out of Aleppo are running from genocide committed by the Syrian army, and those who celebrate on the streets are dancing on children's graves, while al-Qaeda-infiltrated rebels are bravely and heroically defending civilians in East Aleppo. The question is, do you buy it? Because millions of people do.
Do you buy it with that?
Thanks, Carla. All right, so Thomas, what are these things, what do they do? And when we compare what was done in 2016 and what raised concerns about what was done in 2016, how does that compare to what has been done in this election cycle? Is it similar in terms of the type of material, the scale of it, who it's targeted to? If you could just give us a sense of the evolution of this type of activity and what it means.
Yeah, I'll be brief. So what we saw in 2016 is we saw hacking. You know, dial back. Remember, the 14th of June 2016 is when this big Washington Post story broke about the DNC hack. That the DNC had been hacked, and then one day later, on the 15th of June, the first leaks started appearing, first by this hacker claiming to be independent, Guccifer 2, which later turned out to be Russian military intelligence. Now, what we saw was hacking. I think I need to speak into this direction here. What we saw was hacking, sorry guys over there, hacking and leaking. Just very briefly, the evidence that we had in 2016 that this was going on was there from day one. I remember I was doing a threat intelligence class literally on the 15th of June in London, and just a few months prior to that, I was actually at a Russian security conference where we learned some tricks of the trade of malware analysis. So I applied some of that to the material that became available on the 14th of June, as did a lot of people in the InfoSec, information security, cybersecurity community. And there was no doubt that this was actually a Russian hack, and when the leak started, it was equally clear to anybody who in the field that this is a Russian operation. So one of the failures, I think, in hindsight, failures of both the Obama administration, but really also the intelligence community, was that they reacted so slowly to this leaking operation, because it was very clear early on that it was effective, that it was picked up by the press, and the press treated it as genuine material, although already in the very first leak we saw traces of messing with the content of modifying content. metadata mainly, but still. Today, in 2018, we see a lot of hacking still. You know, I'm looking here at a room of high-value targets. I'm not joking. But we don't see any leaks so far. So that's a completely different situation. But I would also like to stress that we are not looking at a general election situation. It's much harder to interfere with a midterm election because there's no presidential election going on at the same time with the same focus. So completely different ballgame. And I'm deliberately completely ignoring the social media aspect right now because I think it's, to be really simplistic in this room, it's blown out of proportion. The most important component of 2016 was the leaking, not the social media amplification. The operation, by the way, was also disjointed. The social media, Twitter especially, and Facebook disinformation component was not synced up with the leaking. But let me make this very personal for a moment for everybody here in the room. I'm going to say something that many of you wouldn't admit freely, but I have it from trustworthy sources that literally everybody in this room has a Google account, maybe also a Slack account. And I'm just assuming here that many of you use their Google account sometimes at work, right? So let me ask you, let's ignore that fact, whether you use it at work or not. And let's just talk about your personal Google account for a moment. Who in this room, and we know hacking is going on, right? You are high-value targets. Who in this room, if I can ask you for a show of hands, who in this room is using advanced security settings, you know, two-factor authentication, a password, and then something else, in order to protect their personal Gmail account? Who is using advanced security settings? And just to repeat, I'm not asking you whether you use your Google account at work. This is not the question. I'm asking, are you actually securing your Gmail account with two-factor authentication? And I'm a little shocked that what I see here is only 1/3 at best. Those of you who haven't raised their hands, you know what to do when you get home. I'm not joking, because it's trivially easy to break into an email account if you don't secure it with two-factor authentication. And of course, there are different ways to do that securely. Don't use SMS, by the way. It's not secure, to keep it simple. Use an app, or even better, a Yubico key for the second step. But really, everybody in this room, I just want to make this sort of very applied for a moment, in my mind, should use actually Google Advanced Protection. And you know, we understand the dynamics here. Using a personal account at work is something that happens everywhere. It happens here. It happens in many companies. I do it too all the time because my Gmail account is more secure than my university account. I'm even using a Gmail account public-facingly because in my line of work, working with a university email account has such a bad reputation because they're so badly secured that I don't want to take the reputational risk of actually using my employer's email account. That's how bad the situation is. It's not much better here, and I think this is a huge problem that all parliaments, all elected, you know, all democracies are facing because the security setup. You know, basically we're looking at 435 small business units in the House and 100 small business units, slightly larger ones in the Senate. So, you know, fixing security raises difficult organizational and ethical issues here. Do you have another minute, or do you want me to?
Yeah, sure, 1 more minute's good.
Okay. So let me say something about the leaking side of things. I spoke about the hacking today. How about the disinformation side? I'm currently finishing up a book on the history of disinformation, 20th century story, really. And what is the goal of disinformation operations? What is the logic of disinformation? I think it's important to sort of state that very clearly. The logic of disinformation is to undermine the trust that we have in the institutions that guard facts, to undermine the trust in law enforcement, because they only function on the basis of fact, to undermine the trust in the intelligence community. They're also, you know, analytically keeping facts, like they're writing factual reports, undermine the authority of investigative journalism, and really undermine also the authority of parts of the public administration, especially election commissions that are in charge of guarding the facts at this moment of great vulnerability that is election night. Because if you can't trust the facts on election night, what are you going to do? If you can't trust the facts, if you can't trust the press when you switch on your TV or when you go to the website of the New York Times or something else, if you can't trust the providers of the facts on election night, then you will default to trusting your tribe. So this is a very unpleasant truth to articulate here. But right now, the biggest threat to the integrity of the election, the biggest threat on that very fragile moment that every democracy is facing on the evening of election night is not Russia. The biggest threat is that powerful people and groups in this country will call the legitimacy of the election itself into question on election night. Now, when that happens, we're facing a very dangerous moment, because election night is also a moment where the peaceful transition of power is on the line. So I think, and I really apologize for sounding so dire and alarmist here, but I think, and also apologize for not looking into this direction, but I think in this building, you should really have conversations, with your member of Congress or your senator, and nudge them to have private conversations about what to do in the heat of the moment on election night if shit hits the fan, because it could. And if that happens, then we're looking at a very dangerous moment, and we have to be ready to face that moment and not improvise when it comes to that. Because ultimately, the responsibility to de-escalate will be in Congress. Nobody else, it can't come from the executive branch. Nobody else will have the political clout and power in that moment to sort of step forward and say, let's relax. This is what happened. This is what we should do. So yeah, I'd like to close with that.
Okay. So thank you. So Alina, Carla showed the videos that are an attempt to sort of structure the way people are thinking about particular issues, and Thomas just talked about the different efforts underway that can undermine trust in institutions and cast doubt on legitimacy. Is this part of some kind of coherent Russian strategy vis-a-vis the United States? If so, whose strategy is it? And how should we be thinking about sort of the big picture of what is going on the Russian side?
Yeah, no, thanks, Jim. And I'm very lucky to be following these two presentations because, one, I hope I won't be as dark as Thomas has been, and hopefully I'll combine some of what you've shown us as well. I think it's important to remember that what Thomas is talking about and the disinformation activities of RT on Facebook and Twitter, et cetera, don't take place in a vacuum. There is a much broader ecosystem here, an ecosystem of political warfare, which includes disinformation campaigns to the co-optation of social media, which includes cyber attacks and leaks, which includes then the amplification of those leaks. And true, in the US case, these were not coordinated, but they did try to coordinate them in the French case during the Macron elections, unsuccessfully. Can talk a little bit about why it was unsuccessful, but it seemed like they had learned that they should have had a better coordination mechanism there. And it also includes things like political influence. So co-opting individuals, political parties, or not even co-opting them, just forging strategic alliances, for example, with anti-EU, pro-Russian, far-right political parties in Europe, which the Kremlin has built out a network of relationships with, including formal cooperation agreements with at least 4 of those political parties. And it also includes, I think most importantly, money laundering and illicit finance. So the buying of influence in European countries, in the United States, through the export of kleptocracy. I think to my mind, this is the most difficult issue to explore because it's very difficult to trace those financial flows unless you're in the intelligence community. But there's also a lot more that we can do in the United States and in Europe to try to close off some of those opportunities. So we have to look at this as a basket of tools, as an ecosystem. It's not necessarily always coordinated. I agree with you there, Thomas. But then in the grand scheme of things, amplifies the objectives that Russia is trying to pursue. But it's very obvious this is not just about Russia. I mean, Russia has pioneered some of these tools, but now that it's shown how effective these low-cost operations can be, they will clearly and are clearly already being used by other hostile foreign actors. And so the way these things function, so the toolbox I mentioned, is that they exploit gaps, they exploit loopholes in our legal systems, like campaign finance regulations, for example, and they exploit divisions in our societies. I think all of you are familiar with how that happens on Facebook, by support through Black Lives Matter on the one hand, and the white nationalist groups on the other hand, and trying to coordinate protest movements and things like that between these various groups. I won't go into too much detail about that. But I think the bigger point about the strategic intent is that I do think it's also important to recognize that what Russia has done and continues to do has not been innovative or sophisticated from a technical perspective. They've basically taken the tools that already existed out there that corporations use, the private sector use. So like Nike, for example, would use the same micro-targeting tools on Facebook or Twitter or Google to try to sell sneakers to men between the, ages 17 to 19 living in the suburbs of Michigan who bought Adidas sneakers in the last 6 months and who may have all of these other attitudinal demographic characteristics. These kinds of micro-targeting tools that allow for not just precision marketing, but also precision propaganda exist because there's a multi-billion-dollar industry behind every piece of content that we see online. So in your Facebook tweet, in your Twitter feed, wherever, in your Google search, what appears first, that is already a manipulated environment. And the environment is manipulated not so much by hostile actors, but it's manipulated by market forces. And what Russia did in their operations is that they were able to co-opt these tools, and what they're able to achieve is, with very little money, very high impact. And by impact, I don't mean changing the outcome of the election. I don't see a lot of evidence that that's what happened in the United States, given the low level of Russian engagement. What I do see is that for the last 2 years, our entire political system and debate and conversation has been completely overtaken by, we're still talking about it, and we're in the midterms, about what the Russians did. Is Donald Trump, a Manchurian candidate? Did Hillary lose legitimately knowledge? We're still talking about these issues for 2 years, and they're incredibly divisive to our society. And so from that perspective, it's been incredibly successful and high impact at a very low cost. So why did the Russians do this? I think is your bigger question. Why do they continue to do this? Well, I think we have to understand what the Kremlin does from the perspective of a pretty rational actor. The Russia today faces quite a significant number of constraints. Those constraints being limited resources. The Russian economy is relatively small and it will stagnate for the foreseeable future. So it's not China. The government can't just snap its fingers and have an AI strategy that will invest hundreds of billions by 2030. They can't do that. They don't have a capacity for homegrown private sector innovation, so they can't compete with the United States. Russian attempts to set up a Silicon Valley have been pretty much a failure. This is the center called Skolkovo they tried to set up some years ago, which hasn't spurred the kind of innovation that we see coming from the United States and increasingly from China. And it has a major human capital problem. Russia is experiencing a brain drain. We don't know a lot about the details of it, but certainly anecdotally we know that a lot of individuals who have tech sector skills, who speak English, other European languages, don't have a lot of opportunities in Russia because the economy is broken. There's very little growth projected, and it's hydrocarbon dependent. much like the Soviet economy was. So it's very difficult for an educated young person to be able to pursue opportunities there, especially if they can go elsewhere. So in my view, if I'm sitting in the Kremlin and I'm trying to think through how to achieve my broader strategic goal, which is what Thomas said, to undermine the West, undermine trust in democratic institutions and other institutions underpinning democracies in the West, I see that I'm outflanked militarily, I'm outflanked economically, but there are very convenient targets of opportunity if we invest in asymmetric warfare. And of course, from the Russian perspective, and this has been a long-forming part of Russian military doctrine, warfare isn't just about tanks or no tanks. It's a spectrum. And information warfare is very much part and parcel of that spectrum. And over the course of the last, let's say, maybe since 2006, but certainly it's been accelerated in 2012, the Russian government has been investing, we don't know how much, obviously, in developing its tool of asymmetric warfare. And this, again, is a rational strategy, because this is where the Kremlin can still have comparative advantage, where it lacks that comparative advantage in other arenas. And at the end of the day, it's a zero-sum view of the world, meaning that you don't have to be a great power, which is, of course, the aspiration that Putin sees himself reaching. The aspiration isn't matched by reality. But you don't have to be a really great power. All you have to do is kind of push everybody else down so that your stock rises above them. And that's really the view of the world, and that's really how I understand all of these influence operation and where they fit in the broader spectrum of Russian foreign policy in general. And so because we're talking to all of you who are congressional staff, and you have to think about what do we do about all this, not just what is it. I do think there's a few things that you may want to take into consideration probably after the elections are over. Down the line, we are still engaged in fighting the wars of yesteryear. We still don't know what to really do about social media manipulation and disinformation. The US government has not responded in a coordinated way. We also don't have the institutions we used to have during the Cold War. So one thing I would say is that what's coming at us, if I'm right about Russian strategic investments in this space, is much more sophisticated tools of precision propaganda and disinformation that will harness the power of emerging technologies like artificial intelligence to be much more precise. And this is still going to be very cheap. They don't have to invent these algorithms. They're all out there in open source. So it's the amazing part. Anybody can make deep fakes. Anybody can manipulate audio. Anybody can manipulate video, place people's faces. You know about all this, right? I don't have to tell you. You're all like young and part of the digital revolution in a way that we're not. But there are things that Congress can do. I think, one, we haven't had an updated AI strategy. Because this is really the core of the future of political warfare, in my view. Congress should take a much more active role in crafting what that is and potentially seeking to incorporate more aspects of a real AI strategy into the NDAA. I mentioned illicit finance. Beneficial ownership legislation is absolutely key here. A registry that I think has been proposed in multiple bills now, in which there is a registry of beneficial ownership, final ownership, that is regulated, administered by FinCEN. This would not be public, which is what it is in the UK, but it would bring up the US to some level of standards with like the Cayman Islands, potentially, not necessarily with our European friends and allies. And this, I think, would be an easy fix, and it would go a very long way in at least blocking some of those initial loopholes and gaps that we have in a regulatory environment. So I'll stop with those two things.
Great, thank you. Carla, I wanted to just come back to what you were showing us at the beginning, and especially in the context of what Thomas and Alina have discussed with us. In terms of addressing this challenge, I mean, we don't in this country, as a matter of course, seek to regulate content. And so,
thank God.
So we have a Pulitzer Prize winning reporter here but we don't say that we're going to, not have this other voice out there just because it's spewing disinformation and isn't at the same level as somebody like you. So so both of those voices are out there for the public to choose from.
Are you saying that Anissa is more persuasive than I am?
I didn't say Anissa was more persuasive than you are, but what do you do in that type of a situation?
Listen, this is why it's asymmetric warfare. And that's, and there's no question that free societies are soft targets for, and one of the things, listen, Putin's got a lot of problems, and that's one of the reasons why he's chosen to do this, but they got something that we didn't figure out. They saw our vulnerability, and they saw that there's a fundamental frustration in developed societies that they're tapping into. If there were not more basic political problems going on, this wouldn't be so persuasive. I mean, we have to think about this in greater terms. This isn't just, if we shut this down, this would go away. There is something else that we, to be slightly more optimistic here. Thomas pointed out that we in the press were much like the way 4-year-olds play soccer. Everybody raced after the ball during the 2016 election and didn't say, gee, the hacking story itself was far less of an interesting story than what was in Hillary's emails. It was only later that we all got a little bit smarter about this. I think there's actually quite persuasive proof that we are capable of learning. The French elections, we talked about this in passing, the French took a look at what happened with us, and when they dumped those 9 gigs of information from Macron's hacking, now granted they had a blackout period, and we can talk about there had been forensic research of a variety of things that went on there, but there was more of an awareness there. There's an entire fact-checking process that's going on that went on in the Brazilian elections, a fact-checking process that have been financed that goes out of the Shorenstein Center at Harvard. There's an attempt here to, in the press at least, in the American press and in the press around the world, to try not to make that same mistake. If Thomas is right that the real problem in 2016 was not Facebook and Twitter, and I'm not saying that he was right or wrong on this, the real problem was that the press all raced to that one story itself, I think we're smarter. And I think we have more self-awareness on it, but I think we have to be vigilant. Editors have to be vigilant, reporters have to be vigilant, and we have to learn. We have to be aware of these things. I know Thomas is not going to agree with me. He doesn't think we're capable of learning, but I would argue that we are more self-aware, and there's certainly a huge effort across the journalism community, not just in this country, but across the world, to use a variety of tools, including crowdsourced information, to do fact-checking and make sure this stuff doesn't take off. Now, does that mean that people are not going to believe in their Facebook feed that the Pope endorsed Donald Trump? There will be people who believe that. But I think that next time something's hacked, we're not going to behave like 4-year-olds going after the soccer ball.
Can I respond to this?
Sure.
Please.
I mean, I do believe that we are capable of learning. After all, my business is teaching, so I mean, to a degree, I have to believe in learning.
I meant we as journalists.
Oh, still, I even teach journalists. But the problem is a little more complex than that, obviously, because have you, and this is a genuine question, have we seen that mea culpa moment in American journalism, that is comparable to what happened after the Iraq invasion? What I see is, and saw, to an extent still see, is a really impressive amount of self-righteousness in covering Facebook and Twitter, but Facebook more than Twitter, for reasons that I really don't understand. Pointing the finger at social media companies with a certain feel-good attitude. We are in the off-the-record phase of the conversation now, so I feel I can make it a little more lively.
We're actually not yet in the off-the-record phase, but please go on.
Okay, fair enough.
As if anything could be off the record with 150 people in the room, but please do go on.
As in not on the website later on, but fair enough. So I mean, the point is that take the Podesta leaks. Every day of October 2016, we had one leak coming out, actually a little more than one per day. And it was just exasperating to watch how, like, Pavlov's dog's conditioned to follow the stick. At that level, it was not a secret anymore that an influence operation was underway of major proportions. So that was really depressing to watch. But I don't want to relitigate the past. And
Okay, I believe, and I think if you look at the fact-checking exercises that have been set up, which have been done with consortiums of newspapers, this is, I'm not going to comment on the self-righteousness of journalists versus the self-righteousness of academics, given the fact that I'm both. But certainly, if you look at the effort that has been made in subsequent elections to do fact-checking exercises, certainly there is a very strong sense of awareness of the dangers that are out there and the desire not to fall into a trap. Whether there has been a transcendent mea culpa moment of the level that you want. The media is not one big blob. There's many different news organizations. But I would say that these fact-checking exercises shows an awareness that we don't want to get fooled again.
Sure, so agreeing is boring for the audience, hence.
I have one question for Alina following up on her presentation, and then we're going to open it up. We're going to turn off the cameras, and we'll get your questions. So you mentioned the need to update the AI strategy, incorporating that into the next NDAA, and just wondered if you could just say a couple words about the types of things you think need to be done in that regard.
I did forget to mention one thing that I think is worth thinking about. I mentioned the online advertising industry, which is now basically the wild, wild west. It's completely unregulated. One reason for that is because social media, private sector space has been completely unregulated as well. It reminds me of the days of big tobacco. This is going to be a controversial example, comparing Facebook, Twitter, Google to big tobacco in the 1950s. But I think what we're talking about at the end of the day is how do you affect behavioral change among people? And it is possible through a combination of regulation, civil society activism, new institutions being built, and awareness raising. So, how do we go from the 1950s when big tobacco was also completely unregulated? Completely. And in fact, pregnant women were recommended that they should smoke for smooth delivery. So how do we go from that to smoking essentially being outlawed? I mean, it's essentially illegal in the United States in most places. Well, it took a combination of congressional action. It took a combination of messages coming from trusted sources, which is, again, goes back to this question of the key crux of our democratic institutions are norms. And if you don't have a trusted source, like the Surgeon General was a trusted source in the tobacco example, how can you actually get people to believe in anything? And that's why the attacks that we've all been describing have been targeting this one specific area. And then, of course, it took a lot of public awareness campaigns and lots of money. At the end of the day, things like labeling on cigarettes also didn't work, just like labeling on certain content on social media doesn't work. In fact, Facebook did a quick beta test of labeling disputed content, and guess what? People clicked on it more, right? Because human psychology makes us want to look at train wrecks, and it makes us want to look at that, hidden, dirty, sexy stuff, that we're not supposed to be looking at. And if something's disputed, you're like, oh, that's bad, I want to look at it. So I think the question to all of us is, how do you think about messaging that somebody doesn't reject automatically? Because people don't respond well if they have a strongly held belief and you present them with facts that counter that belief. It doesn't actually matter. People actually double down on their belief, right? And there's a lot of social psychology research that shows it. So I think we're still having this conversation. So I'm talking about the wars of yesteryear. So about the wars of the future, Jim, which is what you actually asked me about, on AI issues. One, a lot of this work is happening in the classified space, and we don't know about it. At least I don't know about it. And I accept that. So there may be things happening. My sense is that most of what's probably happening has a very clear military dimensions about swarm technology and autonomous drone technologies and things like that. We need to understand is what is the range of US government investment, research and development in artificial intelligence across all the agencies, not just DoD. Can we have a classified assessment of that? It has to be classified. Where are we investing? And if there is an attack of this nature that utilizes some of these new technologies like GAN's technology, generative adversarial networks, which is what produces these deep fakes, how do we set up a system of metrics to respond? We don't have processes or mechanisms. There's no interagency process that I know about that would get the US government to turn on when there's a response needed or not turn on when there's no response needed, right? So we need to be thinking about resources, about understanding implications not in just the military space, but in public diplomacy, for example, absolutely critical. State Department, DHS. We have the capacity and the tools, but we're not thinking about that next piece. And that's really what I'm talking about. I'm talking about the implications of artificial intelligence. It's not just about the shifts in our economy and what jobs will be lost and jobs will be gained. These are dual-use technologies at the end of the day, and they can be used for good and evil, just like Facebook or Twitter, as we found out.
Great, thanks. Well, I do want to open it up, and so we'll move on to the unrecorded part of this session so that you can ask whatever questions